President Putin himself, who made this point publicly, and from China, has been to warn against the effects of Golden Dome on strategic stability. So going back to our discussion earlier of how Reagan's initiative threatened to unbalance, to break that strategic balance. So the strategic balance meaning the nuclear balance between two adversaries, where you've got that mutual assured destruction, knowing that if you launch a nuclear salvo against your enemy, they have the capability to respond and destroy you in turn. Well, again, if you deploy an effective space-based missile defense system, then the adversary might not be able to launch that counterattack. And this is how that nuclear balance is broken. There are massive things underway in US military space policy. The Space Force is actually a new whole branch of the US military. So it's a pretty big deal. It's taken over all the military space capabilities of the United States, and the service is still building up. But now, as people might have seen in the news this week, President Trump has launched this new big project called Golden Dome, which is a missile defense project. Originally, the idea was to have an American version of the Iron Dome, but much, much bigger, obviously covering, providing security for the entire United States, but actually with the global coverage, because the United States can be targeted with very long-range missiles, with intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from any point on the globe. So this would be a space-based architecture with space-based interceptors that would be fired from space and intercept missiles in their intra-atmospheric course. So basically airborne targets. And this is a huge development. I think it opens up a new era in space warfare, because for the first time, the United States has made it its policy to place weapons in space that can conduct space-to-Earth strike, so effectively bombardment from orbit. And the point to keep in mind here is that, once you have the principle established that, you can target an airborne target from space, why not strike a ground-based target or a target at sea from space? So this is, in President Trump inimitable style, this is huge. It's going to be a very big deal for US space policy. It will be a very expensive program. And, it will have massive industrial and strategic repercussions.
And the no weapons in space convention, as it were, that's not just a sort of US policy. That has been a sort of a millstone of international agreements since the space race back in the 60s, hasn't it? Would this just throw all of that away?
So there is a distinction here to be made between no weapons in space and no nuclear weapons in space. What we actually have through the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is a prohibition on mass destruction weapons placed in space, so effectively nuclear weapons. So that is what is banned by international law, which all states are signed up to. There is no ban and no convention saying you can't put conventional weapons in space. And indeed, during the Cold War, there were plenty of tests of conventional weapons for space intercept and other offensive military operations. Indeed, in recent years, the Chinese, the Russians, indeed, the Indians as well, they've conducted direct ascent anti-satellite tests, so basically shooting down satellites from the ground. This has always really been more of a taboo rather than a legal sort of block on putting conventional weapons in space. The idea was always that once someone starts deploying such weapons in orbit, this would be a very destabilizing measure, a destabilizing step that would impact strategic stability, lead to a potential arms race in space. And it was always felt that no one really had any interest in going down that road. But of course, the strategic environment has changed. Geopolitics have changed massively, as we know, and the behavior of our adversaries, especially China and Russia, has become much more concerning. Long range strike technology, so long range missiles, especially hypersonic missiles, are now coming online in increasing numbers. So we're looking at, defense planners are looking at the future, trying to see how this threat will evolve over the next few years and decades. And they are seeing whole arsenals of these weapons being built and being in the possession of a potential enemy. So you need to have some kind of defense against them. And it is essential, the essential component really for defending against advanced future missile threats is the space component, because you need space-based sensors to detect and track missiles and direct interceptors to target. You can really only do that properly, quickly, and with global coverage from space.
And coming back briefly to this idea of the Golden Dome, this isn't just a Trump sort of brainwave, as it were. This all harkens back a lot to what was called Star Wars program, doesn't it, during the Cold War under Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, absolutely. You could call it a Reagan revival project. That is true, but the difference is, so Reagan had the same idea. You're right. So put a missile defense system up in space, so that it would alter the strategic balance so the nuclear strategic balance in America's favor, because the idea was mutual assured destruction, and if one side you know managed to get to build a capability that would negate the other side's nuclear response to an attack, then that nuclear balance would have been broken and would have put the Russians in this case at a severe disadvantage. And indeed, there is quite a bit of literature contending that Star Wars, Reagan's program, was one of the main reasons why the Soviet Union folded in the Cold War, because they realized they either sort of gave up this massive confrontation, Cold War standoff with the Americans, or they had to compete with Star Wars and put their own missile defense architecture in space, which was prohibitively expensive, so they couldn't really pay for it. So but yeah, so Trump is reviving that idea, but with new technologies. So we are now 40 years since Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. That was its formal name at the time. And key technologies have matured, manufacturing processes have matured, and most importantly, launch costs have obviously dropped massively. I mean, we live in a completely new world in terms of launch costs. As you know, Elon Musk and SpaceX, they're able to execute reusable launch. So, a big part of the cost of deploying this kind of architecture in Reagan's time would have been the launch cost, but now that cost is much less. So the whole thing is more feasible. With the advent of AI and very advanced data processing technology, you're able to actually handle the massive amounts of sensor data and tracking data that you need to execute these missions. You're able to do that in a way that it was just not possible before.
And NATO and America's European allies have been really reacting to this breakneck level of change that's been going on in the US's strategic objectives. This is going to be another thing that they are going to have to change their own planning and strategies around, isn't it?
Well, one hopes so. The striking thing about the European defense conversation that we've heard in earnest, especially since Trump has come to office, and of course, there's been this panic about the breakdown in transatlantic relations and the United States withdrawing, its potentially pivoting away from Europe, and shifting the burden onto the Europeans, the security burden onto the Europeans, and this sense in Europe that Europe is on its own, and it needs to build its own defense to compensate for that American military capability that might be moving away from Europe. So this whole conversation and the idea that Europe will build an autonomous defense that can stand on its own 2 feet, as it were, this conversation has not really included that much talk about the space layer of this future European defense. And in my view, this is a major oversight. I mentioned this in this new report that I published the other day for the Council on Geostrategy, called "Rethinking UK Defence Space Posture," which is, as you can imagine, which discusses exactly these issues, how Britain should answer, should respond to what the Americans are doing in space. But yeah, so the Europeans don't really have a proper conversation on how that space layer of the future European defense capability will look like. And I think that is a big oversight, because Europe, as does America, Europe has the same requirement for future missile defense on a continental scale, really. And you need those space-based systems to execute that in the future. But beyond that, Europe is very far behind in terms of military space capabilities, even in the more traditional sort of technology areas of military space power, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance from space. They're doing a bit better perhaps on communications, but launch, again, European launch capability is now being reconstituted with Ariane 6, the new launcher, but it's still very limited. So Europe has always been it's been very good at space science. It's got exceptional space technology, especially in science, as I say, but it certainly does not have a coherent European defense space program or plan of any sort. There is no such thing as European space power. There are individual countries. The French are doing the best on this, in the most advanced in terms of military space capabilities. But in general, Europe is very far behind on the space segment. And I think, again, this is a very big blind spot in the European defense conversation, because without space, you won't be able to fight modern warfare and to even use all these other weapons in the other domains, to use them properly. Almost everything depends on having that space coverage,
And so, what are the key steps, if we take the UK as a case study of European nations? What are the key steps the UK could take now to keep itself in step with the US?
I think the first point is doctrinal alignment. So everything starts with how we think about things and the strategies that we put in place. And of course, then, those will determine the capabilities that we want to build. And of course, then the big question about how you actually deliver them. But it all starts, as I say, with doctrine, with how we perceive our own interests to look like in space, with what is the strategic intent of the UK in space. And this is where we need to urgently reconsider our posture, as I was saying in my report. And what is really happening in America now is that America is pivoting from a defense-oriented space posture and doctrine to a very offense-oriented one. They've published in recent weeks 2 very important documents: a new doctrine document for the entire Space Force, and the framework for warfighting in space. And they make it clear that the US Space Force is now signaling to everyone, to allies, to adversaries, that it sees its core mission now as space superiority, and it considers itself to be a combat service. And it even goes so far as to state clearly, black on white, that space, its mission is really focused on combat, and space is not, its first mission is not to support ground operations, but to actually conduct space warfare. So this is a big change. They also speak officially. They've got it now in their doctrine and in their policy to deploy systems in the future that can support the mission of what they call terrestrial strike from orbit. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. But this is now part of their doctrine, and this is a huge turnaround. It's a 180-degree change from what we've seen in recent years, and certainly under the previous administration, the Biden administration, which was really focused on a much more sort of liberal approach to questions of space security. So relying more on norms and rules and changing behaviors and shaping behaviors through international legislation and negotiation and so on. Talking a lot about space arms control and other international initiatives like this. So it was a very normative approach, and now we're stepping into a very different context. And I'm saying that, and of course, the United Kingdom has been completely aligned with that dispensation. So much so that the current UK defence space strategy, which was issued in 2022, did not even mention once words like war or war fighting or combat. Which is perhaps understandable for that time, but in the intervening years, we've seen massive changes. We're seeing now the Space Force moving in a very different direction. So we need to really review all of that and review what our priorities are. And one big point that I made in my report was that while we need to continue as a nation, the UK MOD needs to continue with building sovereign capability in the traditional areas of space. So space domain awareness, space ISR communications, and so on. We also need to focus much more intently on strategic space-based warfare systems and on counter-space capabilities for space control. Because, again, we are stepping into an era of space warfare, and we need to be ready to protect ourselves in space as we do on Earth.
And you mentioned earlier, it's not just America's allies that are going to be paying attention to this. It's going to be their adversaries as well. I mean, how did key players like China and Russia react to this sort of thing?
So we've only seen some initial reactions. We were expecting these to, take a clearer form and shape, and as time goes by a bit. They're waiting to see exactly how the Golden Dome sort of develops and what else the Space Force decides to actually put in motion in terms of programmatic decisions for capability development in the United States. But so far, the first reaction, both from Russia, and I believe it was even President Putin himself who made this point publicly, and from China, has been to warn against the effects of Golden Dome on strategic stability. So going back to our discussion earlier of how Reagan's initiative threatened to unbalance, to break that strategic balance. So the strategic balance meaning the nuclear balance between two adversaries, where you've got that mutual assured destruction, knowing that if you launch a nuclear salvo against your enemy, they have the capability to respond and destroy you in turn. Well, again, if you deploy an effective space-based missile defense system, then the adversary might not be able to launch that counterattack, and this is how that nuclear balance is broken. So this is really big. Big stuff is very, very important. Strategic stability is probably the most fundamental element of international stability. And I'm sure the Chinese and the Russians will use this argument to the maximum in order to try to deter the Americans from going down this road. But there is much more to say on that. I think they are manipulating that argument a bit. And the Golden Dome initiative is actually responding to an increase from the Russians and the Chinese in their own counter space capability, and it's a response to their own aggressive behavior. So, of course, now that the Americans are actually doing something about it, they will cry foul. But this is how things go in international security.
And does Russia or China have any of these capabilities at the moment in space themselves?
No, they don't. So this is again, we are now talking about the frontier, really, of military technology. So you can imagine, for example, the task of intercepting an intercontinental ballistic missile in its boost phase, so intercepting it from orbit. That is an immensely difficult thing to achieve. You basically have about 4 to 5 minutes to detect the launch and send an interceptor and perform that intercept. All in a short window of 4 to 5 minutes, while the target missile is in its boost phase, so burning through its first stage. It's very bright. You can see it very well with space-based sensors, and it's very vulnerable because it's on a set trajectory. So that is very difficult to do, and so the Russians and Chinese don't really have that technology yet. I mean, it's not a single technology; it's a family of technologies that are involved in delivering that kind of mission. But and the other thing that they don't have yet is the launch capability. As I said, the Americans have reusable launch at the moment. Of course, the Chinese are very hot on their heels now. They are perfecting that technology. We expect it to come online in the next few years. So in the future, the point is, in the future, we will see, it's almost certain that we will see a space arms race with the Chinese and perhaps less so the Russians, seeking to respond to Golden Dome. Whether that will be a symmetric or an asymmetric response remains to be seen, because Golden Dome is very expensive. There have been uh, estimates from the United States from various quarters, including the agencies in the U.S. government, that it might cost up to 175 billion. There is an initial sum of $25 billion allocated to it, but it's not been voted yet in Congress. But we're talking about ultimately hundreds of billions, of course, over time, over 10 years or so. But this is not cheap, right? So it'll be a very, very expensive thing to do. So that's another sort of that adds to the Chinese difficulty in responding to it. But they might try a symmetric response. I mean, it's almost certain that they will. And again, this will lead to new counter space technologies being deployed in orbit. They don't all have to be in the form of a Golden Dome equivalent.